Okay, well, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Robinson again. And today we're going to be tackling a couple of objections, some of the main objections you hear when you're talking about the Byzantine text. And if you do a quick Google search for, arguments against the so-called majority text, and maybe at some point we'll tease out the difference between the majority text and the Byzantine text form. There is a slight difference there. But there is an article by Dan Wallace. It's called "The Majority Text and the Original Text, Are They Identical?" And one of the objections that Dan Wallace raises there, I'm going to just quote him here. He says, "The extant Greek manuscripts, the primary witnesses to the text of the New Testament, do not include the Byzantine text in the first 4 centuries." So, to a layperson, that might seem like a devastating argument against Byzantine priority or majority text theory. I'm going to ask Dr. Robinson if he would like to respond to that claim.
Well, certainly, the problem really lies in the sparseness of material. The papyri have, because they are fragmentary, they have just a small amount of readings in most cases. The exceptions are P45, P66, P75, for example, in the Gospels, and they have a more substantial segment of text where you can actually start classifying the type of text that is in those papyri. But other fragments are so small that if there's one or two readings that may be Alexandrian and the rest of the readings are from that general overall 94% that's otherwise identical, you probably don't have enough to clearly classify a fragmentary manuscript and say, well, it must be Byzantine because it has a Byzantine reading here or there, or it must be, say, Alexandrian or Western because it has a Western reading here or there. This could all be sporadic. And of course, there are Byzantine readings found in the early papyri. This is part of the work that Harry Sturz had done, but even others before Harry Sturz had also noted that this was the case. And this was an important issue because Westcott and Hort made a very key point of their argument that no Byzantine reading could have existed, no distinctive Byzantine reading could have existed before the 4th century because they claimed the Byzantine was the product of a 4th century revision. But the paucity of material that we have among the papyri doesn't give us much of a clue. And even among the more substantial papyri, P75 is the only one that is fully Alexandrian because it's extremely close to Codex Vaticanus of the 4th century. The other papyri have what you would term to be a mixed text, and that means a mixture of readings that are either Alexandrian, Byzantine, or Western, or some combination of that. So that's the papyri. What about the Uncial manuscripts? The first Uncials we have that are relatively complete are, of course, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus of the 4th century. Before that, yes, there are some Uncial manuscripts that are written on vellum, and they are all fragmentary before the 4th century. And in fact, a good number of Uncials after the 4th century are nothing but mere fragments as well. So when you talk about how many manuscripts are actually substantial, say before the 9th century, we are only talking about a few dozen that are really substantial in the amount of text that they cover.
Wow.
So the question is, before the 4th century, everything is sporadic. Even when we get to the ancient versions, it's sporadic because you've got certainly the Alexandrian Coptic manuscripts, you've got the generally Western type Old Latin manuscripts, and then you've got some of these that are mixed, such as the Armenian, the Georgian, and other ancient versions. And Yet you have a generally Byzantine Gothic version that's coming out right around the 4th century. So again, things are very muddled in those first 4 centuries. And the fact that you don't have a solid continuous text Byzantine manuscript is no different than, except for P75, you don't have a solid unified Alexandrian manuscript before the 4th century.
Yeah. Wow. Well, when you realize those things, when you realize that there's just not that much evidence from before the first century, fourth century, when you're talking about actual manuscripts, the devastating argument that it sounds like it is really not much. There's not much of an argument there at all, really.
I would also bring in the patristic writings, that no ancient father except Origen is going to have a thoroughly Alexandrian text. But then again, except for Origen, there are no others with a thoroughly Alexandrian text, nor in the first 4 centuries with a thoroughly Byzantine text. But again, where are our fathers coming from for the most part? They're mostly going to be Western type fathers that are writing in Latin, which would have, as expected, a Western text. And as soon as we start getting a good number of Greek fathers that are actually quoting the scriptures heavily with identification, they start quoting a Byzantine text, generally Byzantine, not always, but generally. And that would include people in the 4th century like Chrysostom, or as we move later to Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, and others. So before the 4th century, the fathers just are not specific. And in fact, from the text of the Greek New Testament in the Early Church Fathers series that is out, the fathers are just about as mixed as the pre-4th century papyri or the pre-4th century Uncial fragments happen to be.
Interesting. Well, you anticipated one of the objections that was in Daniel Wallace's article there that I was going to bring up, and I'm actually going to quote him here too, and then kind of follow up with a question about, because you've already pretty much answered this, but this is something that he says in that article. In summing up the evidence from the early church fathers, in none of the critical studies made in the last 80 years was the majority text found to be the text used by the church fathers in the first 3 centuries. Now, I think you pretty much addressed that, but let me just make sure my understanding is clear on this. That's not to say that there aren't Byzantine readings in the church fathers in the first 3 centuries. So a lot of the people who are watching my channel right now, watching us right now, they're thinking Byzantine versus Alexandrian, and they're thinking major text blocks like the long ending of Mark or something like that. And for some of those like the long ending of Mark, that's in some of our earliest strata of evidence, isn't it? In the church fathers. Am I understanding that right, Dr. Robinson?
Yeah, well, the earliest writer that is clearly quoting and saying the long ending of Mark is from Mark is Irenaeus. And Irenaeus he says, here's how Mark begins. And he even quotes the Byzantine reading there as it is written in the prophets. And he then says, the Gospel of Mark ends, and he quotes the last couple of verses of the long ending of Mark. So again, he's quoting generally a Western type text, but the Western type text happens to agree on the long ending of Mark at that point. It has its own Western variations, but it's still the same long ending. But with the church fathers, the fact that they have mixed texts, again, they don't have a solidly Alexandrian text either, but they do have Byzantine readings. And this is part of what Bergen did. He was tabulating the church fathers, and he has supposedly in the British Museum 16 folio volumes with 86,000 quotations from the church fathers. And he says in these quotations, the Byzantine text actually predominates in individual readings, individual variant readings, in a proportion of 3 to 2, which means basically 60% of the church fathers' readings tend to be Byzantine. That doesn't make a church father Byzantine. but it does make him quote a lot of Byzantine readings as opposed to the 40% that would be either Western or Alexandrian type readings. And I confirmed this later when a fellow, um, Daryl Hannah, wrote a monograph. It was his doctoral dissertation on the text of Second Corinthians in origin. And it turns out, without him even thinking about going this route of Bergen, he ended up with 60% of the quotations from origin in Second Corinthians being Byzantine. And I
And
thought that was just a very stunning coincidence that it just confirmed Bergen in that one book.
well, and I think that's surprising because you would almost anticipate the opposite with Origin, just being from the area that he was from, that sort of thing.
Origin generally has a Alexandrian based text, and that might be reflecting more of what he has in the Gospels. But all I know is what he did in Second Corinthians there, and I just took that as a pleasant confirmation of Bergen.
Yeah. So just a quick summary on the church fathers. Is it as a expert in the field here, you've studied New Testament textual criticism. That is your field. That's what you did, for a living, essentially. I mean, that's your specialty. So, I mean, is there anything in the church fathers that makes you go and say, boy, you know what, the critical text guys, maybe they've got us on this one.
No, I don't think they have us at all if you're just talking about church fathers before the fourth century, because if you tried to put all the readings from the church fathers together and pick and chose eclectically among them, you would still be hard pressed to end up with a text that looks like today's critical text or even the Westcott Hort favorites of Aleph and B, Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Just putting together the church fathers' quotes doesn't result in today's critical text.
Yeah.
They don't result in today's Byzantine text either. But the point is there that you can't use the data from the first 4 centuries to establish or reconstruct either the critical text or the Byzantine text. And partly this is because of the scarcity of material. A church father, for example, unless he's actually writing a commentary on a particular New Testament book, he is very likely to quote from memory. We know this already. He can quote it different times in different manner. There are some fathers that quote the same verse 6 or 7 times and they quote them differently each time. So the question comes is what can you really reconstruct from either a direct quote from the father or even worse, a simple allusion, which may open the door for almost any reading. So there are all kind of problems with the church fathers, and I'm going to separate myself from this because that the church fathers, that area, patristics, is not my area. I primarily work with the continuous text Byzantine Greek manuscripts and the lectionaries. I don't work primarily with the ancient versions. So I would think that if you're going to establish an original form of the Greek text of the New Testament, you've got to stay primarily with the Greek manuscripts, the Greek lectionaries, because these are your primary sources. And if you're going to establish a text of something else, for example, if I were going to establish the text of Tertullian, I'm going to use all the documents of Tertullian there might be, but I won't get a complete New Testament out of it. It's impossible. I'll only get isolated quotations. But with the continuous text Greek manuscripts, as well as with the lectionaries that have selected portions of text, yes, you can put together a continuous running text of the Byzantine that reflects the overall consensus of the manuscripts.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, we've checked off a couple of major objections that you hear floated around quite frequently. Maybe. we'll have an opportunity to address some more in a another video.
That'll be fine.
Okay. All right. Thanks for joining me today.
Okay, thank you.